Hello, everyone. This is a video about the Week 8 study questions. Of course, the way that they're phrased, they're all open-ended, and wanted to see what you thought. But of course, there is a basis for any opinion, and that basis is in the text itself and what issue he's exploring and what stance he's taking. Number one, DeGeorge claims that engineers should not be required to be moral heroes. Do you agree? Suppose that it really depends on what you mean by moral hero. Obviously, a lot of this essay is about drawing limits to the first canon, limits to the engineer's responsibility, especially limits to what we call whistleblowing, which is essentially any time an employee goes to an external source to find redress for a supposed misbehavior of the company or the institution. It doesn't have to be a company, it could be a government agency or really any institution. If blowing the whistle just means going outside the institution, going to a governmental agency or to a governmental entity of some sort, going to the news media, going to professional society, basically pointing out wrongdoing in your institution. So drawing limits to that, I suppose there have to be limits to that, but it's all about where you draw them. DeGeorge concedes in the beginning that the awareness that the engineer has some responsibility in some circumstances to do that is a great advance in engineering ethics. The very fact that we have something called engineering ethics is a great advance for the engineering profession. And the recognition that, yes, there is something called the first canon, and under some circumstances, the engineer, in order to uphold the first canon, needs to be prepared to blow the whistle. But the question is, what is the extent of that? One of the things that he says, memorable things that he says in the beginning, is that the engineer is not expected to have a whistle on their desk and be prepared to blow it at the least sign of any kind of miscreant behavior on the part of their employer all day. That's obviously a rhetorical statement, but you can see where he's going. He thinks that the whole idea that you don't have to be a moral hero means you don't have to sacrifice your career, or at least you don't have to endanger your job or your career at the least question that might come up in terms of malfeasance on the part of your company. But if you're not required to be a moral hero, what are you required to be? I guess is really what the essay is about. Number two, DeGeorge basically judges that the engineers involved in the Ford Pinto case did nothing wrong. Do you agree? Well, it really depends upon your interpretation of the first canon and really your interpretation of what the role of an engineer is within a company and to what extent their professional obligations do or do not outweigh their job limitations, you might say. DeGeorge obviously absolves the Ford Pinto engineers, not because the Pinto was a good car. It wasn't. Not because the Pinto wasn't a danger to the public. It was. But because the kind of safety decisions, like the placement of a gas tank, like the speed at which an impact in the rear of a car causes the gas tank to blow up, basically. Those questions are obviously very important questions in terms of public safety, but his key point is they are not engineering questions. They are managerial questions. Engineers consult on these things. Engineers inform their employer or their client of these things and tell them what will happen if as a result of the decisions that they make. But ultimately, decisions about safety are decisions that need to be hashed out between companies, the management of companies, the government, and the people. And that engineers, again, will inform and consult, but engineers do not have the authority. And I suppose we're never meant to have the authority to actually make decisions about safety. So I don't know if that is a good argument or not. That's really what I'm asking, whether you agree with that. So yeah, I'm sorry I had to pause there, so I lost my train of thought. But basically, do you agree about the limited sense in which DeGeorge thinks engineers are responsible? I think it goes back to the first question. I think his idea is if the Ford Pinto engineers had done any more than they did, they would have been moral heroes, which is not a requirement. Number 3, do you agree with the 4 criteria for whistleblowing that DeGeorge proposes? I believe it's 5, actually. I believe that the first 3 are the criteria for when it is morally permissible to blow the whistle, and the last 2 are the criteria for when it is morally obligatory. I'm pretty sure it's 5. Sorry, made a mistake there. Obviously, it's an opinion question, but I think what's important to note is that division between the criteria for when whistleblowing is permissible, that is, when it's ethically permissible to blow the whistle, what conditions need to be fulfilled before the engineer can ethically blow the whistle. And then the second 2, the more stringent ones, really, for when it is no longer simply permissible, but when it's an obligation, a moral obligation. So what that tells you is that, yes, DeGeorge does think that there are situations in which it is morally obligatory to blow the whistle. And I would suppose that means obligatory if you are going to uphold your first canon obligations. I mean, the criteria are what they are. I suppose what pops out of me about the second 2, when the supposed ones that need to be fulfilled in addition to the first 3, to make it something moral obligatory, is that the engineer needs to have proof. That is, if the engineer had proof that would convince the public and government, and without that, it's never an obligation. I think that's at least questionable, but an interesting criterion. Number 4, in assessing cases like the Ford Pinto, DeGeorge puts the burden on corporations and government to make changes to prevent future cases like this one, rather than the ethics of engineers. Do you agree? Well, this really goes back to question 2 and also question 1. Essentially, questions of public safety, at least questions of things like standards, and ultimately the responsibility to protect the public is not on engineers, it's on government. And that government needs to work with corporations to prevent things like Pinto from happening again. That's an interesting claim, obviously. It's a credible claim. But some people in engineering ethics would certainly say that although, of course, corporations and especially the government need to do things to protect the public, well, so does the engineering profession, independent of whatever connection it may have to either of those entities. Maybe some people would interpret the whole first canon and all of its sort of addenda as being really outlining what those obligations are. So the notion that engineers don't really have any independent obligation to protect the public, to do things to prevent future Pintos is questionable. So that's really what I was thinking about when I wrote these questions.